My name is Jeremy Walton, and here's some video camera basics.
Let's go.
I do a lot of videos on filmmaking, discussing things from directing to cinematography. That can be a little more advanced if people are just starting out, so I want to cover some video camera basics for beginners, why those basics matter, and of course, show you some examples. These simple tips can make a huge difference if you're trying to make this look like this, and why someone who knows what they're doing can actually make this look better than this. Let's get into it. One of the first things you'll need to decide on after buying a camera is what frame rate you'll be shooting in. Now you might already know, or think you know, or you could be totally clueless, so let's break it down so you have, I'm not gonna say the right answer, I'm going to say so you have the right information to determine what's right for you. To answer the frame rate question, we have to go from this to this. Some of the first films without sound were using hand-cranked film cameras. Can you imagine trying to get a constant frame rate by hand? It was usually in the 16 to 18 frames per second. Now at that, okay, enough of this. That's better. Now at that speed, they found 24 frames per second was the sweet spot, but if you have a projector playing something at 24 when it was shot at 16, it'll speed it up, creating that look of old films. There's more to this story with the introduction of sound, but keeping it simple, let's jump ahead when black and white television turned to color. Television broadcast played at 30 frames per second because of the refresh rate that was set to the AC power, which was 60 Hertz. This is getting complicated. Isn't filmmaking great? Basically, they had to reduce the frame rate so the color signal wouldn't interfere, causing issues with sound. That's why you see the frame rate of 29.976 and 23.976. Now today you have a lot of options and a lot of formats. So we still have standards, but because of technology and streaming, this isn't as big of a deal as it used to be. For example, we all had 4x3 TVs, which was fine, but when you tried to play a movie, you had to choose between widescreen, which you'd get the infamous black bars. I know a lot of people hated that. Or you'd see this warning that the picture was modified, which meant the sides were getting chopped off. Now we have people adding black bars to make things more cinematic. I don't know. This would cause filmmakers who were shooting films to frame 4x3 safe. Over time that went away, but now you have to think what people are watching your content on, which can make a difference if you're shooting for 16:9, 4:5, or even 9:16. My point is, things are constantly changing. When it comes to frame rates, you just need to understand the differences, and remember, you could be shooting on two cameras. Both say the frame rate is 24. One could be shooting true 24, while the other one is actually 23.976, or they even sometimes round up and say 23.98. Pick the one you want and make sure when you edit, your timeline matches your frame rate. Start there and you'll be good. Some films have experimented with higher frame rates, like Peter Jackson's The Hobbit, which was filmed at 48 frames per second instead of the traditional 24. A lot of people didn't like it, but who knows, at some point that could change and it could become the standard. Anything is possible. Once you have your frame rate figured out, you need to understand shutter speed. Now the simple explanation is make sure your shutter speed is double your frame rate. Well, that was easy. Should we move on? Oh, why does it need to be double the frame rate? Okay, here we go. If you're shooting at 24 or 23.98 or 23.976, okay, I'm just going to use 24, which is what gets people in trouble in the first place, but we covered that, so we should be good. Double the frame rate would be 48, but your camera may only have 1/50th, so you'll use that, which creates the right amount of motion blur that looks natural. It's what you're seeing now. When I move my hands, there's a blur, which replicates what you would see in real life. Now, what happens if you increase or decrease your shutter speed, which you can do if you want? It's pretty simple. Let me show you what happens when you have a slow shutter speed. The light increases and the motion blur increases as well. This can be a bit trippy. Now what happens when you have a fast shutter speed? The light decreases and the motion blur decreases as well. So depending on the look you want, you either have to add or take away light. This is why when you're using your phone or action camera on a bright and sunny day without an ND filter, which blocks the light, the shutter speed gets cranked to give you a proper exposure. But like I mentioned, that decreases the motion blur, which tends to look a bit odd. This is why the basics matter. Simple things can make a big difference. Now, why would you want to mess with your shutter and go above or below double the frame rate? The best example would be to look at a couple films. One of the most popular examples is Saving Private Ryan. The battle scenes were shot using a fast shutter speed. This was giving the scene a crispness to the soldiers' movements, and with the violent explosions of the battles, you could see each individual particle flying through the frame. That's understanding the basics of cameras and using an effect to tell your story. An example of a slow shutter speed would be Amelie. Sometimes a slow shutter can be used to speed up time or action, but when you watch this scene, you should ask yourself, how does it make you feel? What does this motion communicate to you? And if this is a good vibe, happiness, then maybe you can use a slow shutter speed to convey that. Or what about this scene from Garden State? Same technique with a totally different vibe, which should show you it really is up to you how you use these techniques. But it's hard to do that if you don't know the basics. To round everything off, the next thing we have to take a look at is aperture. That can easily be described as the point in the lens that opens and closes to let more or less light in. From what we talked about already, you can probably tell controlling light is pretty important. When you're looking at buying a lens, you'll see something like an aperture range of f2.8 to f22. The lower the number, like 2.8, means the bigger the opening, allowing more light in. The bigger the number, yeah, the complete opposite. There might be times you need more light. For example, you want a fast shutter, or you're just shooting a scene with low light. If only things were that simple. If it was only a matter of light, that would be easy, but like everything else, whatever you do affects the image. When it comes to aperture, we have to discuss depth of field. When you're shooting at a 2.8, we're going to have a really shallow depth of field. You might have someone's face in focus, but everything else is a blur. If you're shooting at an f8 or higher, then you'll have deep focus, or a lot more stuff will be in focus. That means if you need more light, just opening up the aperture might not be the right choice. It depends on what look you're going for. Let me show you some examples. In The Handmaid's Tale, they like using a shallow depth of field for many reasons, like point of view. With a very specific focus, we are limited to what we can see around us. This can be a great way to tell your story. Done right, you can have great results. Just make sure you're using it for the right reasons. If you want to explore how film and television use some of these techniques, check out my What is Cinematic Filmmaking series, which covers a lot of good information that might surprise you. Some films don't need or want a shallow depth of field. One example of this would be the film The Revenant, which uses wide-angle lenses with deep focus because we need to see what's going on since we're right in the middle of the action. Think how this scene would play out if most of what was going on was out of focus. Choices matter, and I think they made the right choice for this scene. We covered frame rate, shutter speed, and aperture. Of course, there's a lot more to cover and a lot more variables even with the basics, but you gotta start somewhere. Understanding the basics will allow you to make the right choices and the ability to create something new, a different perspective, a new idea, all good stuff for filmmakers. Well, there you have it, video camera basics. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hit that like button because there's definitely more on the way. Subscribe so you don't miss out. Leave a comment if you want to. Until next time, it's a wrap.